that, I call on my co-convener to now introduce the next speakers.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Professor Oditi, for that very nice talk. I think it was very inspiring. I also want to add that I gave this example in class the other day. When you want to marry a woman, you go and you tell the parents, you send your aunties or your uncles to tell the parents they have seen a flower or a plantain that they want to harvest. It doesn't mean that the woman is a flower or a plantain, it's just a symbol. So these symbols are very important in our African societies. So on that note, I would like to go on to the next speaker. It's Dr. Dinah Ofana. She holds a PhD from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And her PhD dissertation is very relevant to what we are doing today, titled An Afro-Communitarian Conception of Gender, Interrogating Gender Inequality Within African Philosophy. And so her paper is titled Interrogating the Intersection of Coloniality and Gender-Based Violence in Africa. Dr. Ofana is currently research associate at the Decolonial Research Group, University of Pretoria, South Africa, and of course, a member of the Conversational School of Philosophy of the University of Calabar. So, Dr. Dinah Ofana, please welcome and let us hear your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the privilege to present my thoughts on the topic, the interrogating the intersection of coloniality and gender-based violence. I'll quickly go to my introduction. The main goal of my presentation will be to highlight how colonialism shaped gender discourses in Africa. This knowledge would then serve as the foundation for how I examine the need to decolonize the logic of Western dominance related to gender-based violence in Africa. We should also bear in mind that there is always this impossibility of discussing the issue of gender and gender-based violence without interrogating the intersection of patriarchy and gender. So the notion of coloniality and its effects on gender are being explored in order to expose the logic of Western gender creation and to demonstrate the possibility of using the African way of thinking as an effective decolonial strategy. Therefore, the logic underlying concepts such as patrilineality and matrilineality in the African worldview would provide more insights on the lopsided logic that undergirds gender-based violence in Africa. This means that the rhetoric of decoloniality should reveal further profound implications for African philosophical studies about colonial logic and its ongoing embodiment in the misuse of the meaning and interpretation of gender. So, decoloniality will be utilized to examine the logic that underpins Western superiority, as well as its impact on how individuals see patriarchy, gender, and gender relationships. In a nutshell, because colonialism promotes epistemological or intellectual supremacy, the approach to overturn such epistemology would be to employ a counter-epistemology from the African context. To effectively express my arguments, I will examine coloniality in terms of patriarchy, gender, and gender roles. The consideration of patriarchy, gender, and gender roles will then lead to a discussion of what and how decoloniality will be used as a lens to examine the logic of coloniality that promotes gender-based violence in African society. So I'll just quickly go over to what is coloniality. So for us to properly understand the logic as well as the workings of coloniality, we must start by examining what colonialism entails. To put in perspective, colonialism is a system of administrative control of territory, while coloniality is a system of intellectual subordination of ex-colonized people's minds and epistemologies. Colonialism's prescriptive form limits transformation, making it resistant to the colonial method and analysis of knowledge creation that are not Western-based. This makes it difficult to deconstruct and reinterpret dominant epistemology. Coloniality in its performative stage restricts transition and reorganization, but it is susceptible to collapse. Its power structure persists unless significant change or anti-systemic movements demand for its deconstruction. Chimakana and Ogbonnaya 2021 argue that colonization strives within entrenchment borders involving land dispossession, exploitation, and excavation of resources. And we see other factors like racism and classism that are prominent elements driven by unjust mechanisms and so on and so forth. So to demonstrate the intersection of coloniality on gender-based violence, I'll briefly illustrate the difference between the interplay between colonialism and coloniality and how it affects gender relations in Africa. So colonialism, which is based on intellectual domination, acts, politics, and economic power, continue to restrict non-Western epistemologies across boundaries, posing enduring challenges for Africans and Africa. So to support this thesis, coloniality has been defined as the systematic preservation of the tools of colonization. It entails sustaining Enlightenment standards while imposing the colonizer's intellectual hegemony on colonized people and ex-colonies. So it is undeniable that colonialism's purpose is to subject other forms of epistemologies to Western dominance. The Western Enlightenment standard is depicted as hegemonic and universal, with the goal of distinguishing between supposed superior and inferior epistemologies. The precedent is what Chimakana and Ogbonnaya described as the in-group and the out-group, the norm and the normalized, the self and the other, the best and the rest. Underlying this sort of dichotomy is the logic of binary opposition that works tirelessly to other vistas of thought, as well as humans. With coloniality, the supposed advanced form of reason, that is the Western mode of knowing, is used as the metrics to foreclose the potential for other forms of reasoning. So I contend that the effect of coloniality has continued to permeate the very essence of African relational experiences, especially the logic of gender relations. It is safe to argue that the colonial oppositional logic is one of the reasons why African societies are experiencing increase in the different forms of gender-based violence. Furthermore, the wealth of knowledge of any given society resides in the logic that governs it. So, colonialism is a Western-dominated ideology that suppresses African moods of thinking and logic, leading to a lack of understanding of reality and perpetuating gender misinterpretation and violence, despite the logic of resistance in the African continent. So when we highlight the negative impact of colonialism on African thought systems, we will see that what we need to do as Africa is to overcome the slave mentality that we have imbibed from colonial infringements and improve ourselves by rethinking the values that we have imbibed from colonial infringement. So the colonial scholars argue that Africans cannot improve without transcending colonial thought processes. To create knowledge free from colonial imposition, a return to the history and thought system of colonized people is necessary. The ontology of a people determines their knowledge system and logic. And the Lovo argues that those without their way of knowledge would have no history of their own choosing. That means whatsoever we are given is what we work with. European-centered modernism undermines the validity of other knowledge and ways of knowing beyond the European perspective, leading to the continued control of colonized people's logic and mindset. To fully comprehend the interplay of the logic of coloniality in relation to gender-based violence, we must unveil the intersection that exists in understanding patriarchy and gender in Africa today. So we know that African feminism differs from Western feminism in so many ways, and I will just briefly go to the difference between African feminism and that of Western feminism to properly illustrate why I am going to be touching on patriarchy, because understanding of patriarchy in the West is quite different for what patriarchy is in Africa. In fact, we don't even call it patriarchy. What we have in Africa is patrilineality and matrilineality as against the patriarchy and matriarchy we have in the West. So Antaga argues that Western feminism may fail to fully address the difficulties confronting African women, since certain ideologies may become anti-male, contradicting African norms of marriage, childbearing, and family preservation. This perceived conflict stems from the possibility that some Western feminist advocacies would turn anti-male, contradicting Western feminist initial concern. But this may not be the case, as I contend that most Western feminist concern regarding gender equality, despite the criticism leveled against it, cannot be anti-men, harmful to family unit and childbearing. We take, for example, the struggle for women's rights to vote and equality. So these cannot be anti-men, even though they have other aspects in Western feminism that may contradict African mood of knowing or relationality. Nevertheless, Western feminism is not without its failings, as the issue mostly raised by scholars is racial inequality, given that race-related oppression towards women of African descent are neglected, which led to the disconnect between the concerns of African women and that of Western women. The preceding is what brought to limelight a theorizing on intersectionality by women of African descent. So the notion of intersectionality that I employ here goes beyond the arguments and ways Western feminists overlook race-related oppression, especially against women of African descent, to demonstrate the interplay of the logic of coloniality that has continued to entrench women's oppression in Africa and the increase of gender-based violence. So to understand the intersectional interplay of African women's oppression, we must also unveil the entrapment of womanhood, how it intersects with gender misinterpretation and abuse, thereby resulting to gender-based violence. So my focus is to show the damage of Western supremacy and gender inequality, as most African and women activists have painstakingly explored the notion of Western supremacy, using the intersectional framework to unveil how oppression and inequality has continued to shape the lives of colonized people. I'm not going to dwell so much on the intersectional framework. I'm just going to quickly dive into the next argument. My argument will be that the concept of patriarchy and its impacts on gender-based violence stems from the notion of gender binary opposition that emanate from Western modernity. Gender binary opposition subsists within a hierarchical system of logic that strives on epistemic and human ordering. That means it works by bifurcating human relations. By so doing, human differences pattern consistently with the logic of opposition that work to keep coloniality alive. The quest for gender equality has led to the emergence of varied identities that have further broadened the scope and understanding of the issues and factors that contribute to gender-based violence. Arguably, the ways in which marginalized groups, specifically women of African descent and the LGBTQ plus individuals, experience and challenge patriarchal structures are a function of colonial influences. By shedding light on the intricate relationship between patriarchy and gender, I hope to unveil the gender dynamics that encourage gender-based violence. The essence of this illustration is to show how we can transcend the logic of coloniality and embrace the logic of complementary gender relations. So I will quickly go into the intersection of coloniality and gender-based violence. My argument is that the intersection of coloniality and gender-based violence requires examining the Western notion of Western supremacist patriarchy and the workings of Western male supremacist ideology. These ideologies underlies white supremacist patriarchy, positioning Western men as part of the patriarchal system. Western male supremacy ensures power remains in the hands of Western males, which is also the basis for global capitalism, which seeks to maximize profit for capitalists through exploitation. Critical analysis of this dominance reveals the societal structure that perpetuates this system. Bell Hooks, for instance, explains that the concept of classism, racism, and sexism is what undergirds the ideology of Western patriarchy. This interlocking system exploits and oppresses women, sustaining the ideology of white supremacist patriarchy. The system involves the enslavement and subordination of third world women, with Western women's economic gains being the enslavement and subordination of these women. This highlights the difference in the struggle of Western feminists from those of African descent, as intersections are often ignored in Western feminism. The loss of African descent, the loss of women of African descent is the gain of Western women, highlighting the importance of addressing the experiences of women from other cultural contexts. Thus, Western supremacy patriarchy trivializes women's place in Western society. So having briefly contextualized the notion of Western idea of patriarchy, my argument is that Western ideology on patriarchy cannot and does not apply to all cultures. The Western idea of patriarchy is not universally applicable, as there is no overarching concept that can explain all situations and societies. However, most academics agree that Western dominant patriarchy is responsible for gender inequality in most nations. So we know that patriarchy simply involves men being socially indoctrinated to dominate women and is primarily systemic. This systemic aspect gives male power over women's sexuality, reproduction, and property rights. In the preceding definition of patriarchy lies the intersection and logic that plays out in the incidences of gender-based violence, clothed in coloniality. Gender-based violence, as we know, is violence directed against a person because of their gender, or violence that disproportionately affects people of a specific gender. Gender-based violence is frequently linked to normative gender expectations and unequal power dynamics in African society. This conclusion is based on a current socio-normative understanding of gender categories and how they impact men's relational conduct towards women. To support this, Tracy Ben-Godley provides more support for this view. She explains that gender-based violence affects women across race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, religion, sexual orientation, and geographic boundaries. No segment of society are immune from the vestiges of this problem. Yet, GBV has been particularly harmful within communities of African ancestry. So going through this, it's kind of dawned on me how GBV has gradually it's become an African thing, or being conceived as an African thing, knowing that the problem actually emanates from the West. So from the preceding, GBV is construed as an African issue rather than a problem that emanates from the misrepresentation of gender relations in Africa. in African society, one can see that there's a shift in context. There's a shift in context, victimhood and oppression. The illusion brought about by this shift is what has contributed to the varied understanding and theorizing on the issue of gender-based violence in Africa by both Western and African scholars. Take, for example, Abede Sultana's belief that African normative social practices are deeply rooted in a disciplinary culture that condones or encourages violence against women. If we critically analyze Sultana's concern, we may see that there exists factual elements in most African cultural practices that encourage gender-based violence. However, it is not the case that African society encourage gender-based violence. The above shows that the problem of GV may have influences outside of Africa. In present African society, GBV is caused by a variety of variables, including individual causes, such as substance misuse, as well as cultural and systemic causes, such as patriarchy, rape culture, and aggressive masculinity. Pumla discussed the aspect of GBV, an aspect of GBV as rape. According to Kola, violent masculinity and rape culture in South Africa, for instance, are systemic because it simply demonstrates how appetite history designated particular people, such as African women, as acceptable targets for rape. The preceding is another point of intersection of colonialism, apartheid, and coloniality. The issue of rape is an aspect of the creation of Western notion of gender and womanhood that should align with the systemic logic of colonial exploitation. Marianne Lungus, for instance, argues that the creation of gender is a mechanism of colonial entrapment rooted in gender dynamics that impact gender inequality in African societies. This logic is driven by a diversive hierarchical system that sustains relational power dynamics in gender interpretation and relationships. Lungu's analysis of the colonial notion of gender reveals another aspect of intersection another aspect of intersection that mostly becomes a blind spot in gender discourses. What I mean here is that the understanding of gender in Africa is not a weapon of division, but a representation of human unique differences. Nevertheless, with Western infiltration comes the abuse and misuse of gender, bearing colonial imprints in various aspects of gender relationship, such as the repressive system that hinders women of African heritage from living in freedom, integrity, and well-being. This system of indifference ignores power dynamics at the level of commonplace gender relations, which can be seen in theories about women's oppression and emancipation, as well as in ordinary gender relations. So with gender dynamics comes power dynamics, which ultimately encourages gender abuse and gender-based violence. The rape factor is one of the many factors of gender-based violence that is commonly experienced in most incidences of gender-based violence. It is for this reason that Kola argues that the culture of rape strips a person of their human rights and dignity, one that the Constitution of South Africa cannot preserve. Kola contends that rape culture regards women's bodies as disposable, resulting in an increase in rape cases across African nations, notably in South Africa. Gender-based violence, which includes street harassment, domestic abuse, and rape, is more widespread than most people think. Millions of people, especially women and girls, are affected every day. We all have the responsibility to educate ourselves and to try to eliminate violence so that our children do not have to experience it. So my last section is the decolonial interrogation of the issue of gender-based violence and how it impacts African philosophy. So decolonization, as we know, is an ongoing process of challenging and replacing dominant colonial narratives. And this process is particularly important when addressing issues of gender-based violence. In Africa, for instance, the issue of gender-based violence has been largely overlooked and in African philosophy, the issue of gender-based violence has been largely overlooked and under-theorized. despite its significant impact on individuals, societies, and the construction of knowledge. To interrogate the intersection of decolonization and gender-based violence in African philosophy, the logic of relations must be addressed. Drawing on a decolonial understanding of gender relation, I consider reinterpreting gender relations using the complementary logic, one devoid of the lopsidedness of gender opposition. In doing so, the contextual epistemic individuality of persons are recognized and considered irrespective of gender. Through a decolonial lens, gender complementarity is a concept that we can explore or can become an alternative framework for understanding and addressing gender-based violence in Africa, including indigenous knowledge systems and community-based approaches. So when we critically examine the gap in theorizing on the issue of gender-based violence in African philosophy, African philosophers are to consciously decolonize the concept of Western patriarchy and matriarchy that has replaced patrilineality and matrilineality that stems from African ontology. So the concept of patrilineality and matrilineality is understood from the backdrop of African logic and ontology as it promotes gender complementarity rather than gender binary opposition. If the values in African system of thought encourages complementarity, why the criticism against African philosophy and the notion of personhood in particular? We know of many scholars that have criticized the notion of personhood in particular, and African philosophy, how it is gendered and how it does not consider the place of women. However, I contend that African philosophy is holistic in its approach to reality. However, the issue we should be looking at is with the practitioners of African philosophy who have failed to capture the unique phenomenon of gender differences in the representation of African philosophy. So the logic of gender difference in Western two-value logic will always bifurcate reality into unequal parts if nothing is done by African practitioners. This inequality is what undergirds the notion of gender relations that has continued to encourage gender-based violence in present-day African society. And in African philosophy, arguably, problematizing gender-based violence as a philosophical issue may be contended. However, a critical interrogation of the issue of gender-based violence as a philosophical issue would unveil the intersection of coloniality in the theorizing of most African philosophers who have failed to consciously free themselves from colonial mental entrapment. The illusion of freedom that we think we have is what makes us think that we can clearly demarcate African philosophy as a philosophical discipline from the person actively engaged in doing African philosophy. So my submission is that the conscious application of African logic that is not colored by Western linguistic semantics will make us think of our collectiveness as Africans. And it will make us look at our gender relationship intricately, and then we'll become more humans in our dealing with ourselves, in our relationship with, in our personal relationship. So my preceding claim may not sound convincing to those suffering from colonial amnesia. I mean those who believe social relations and attitude could or can be detached from a people's logic. Social policies, systems, and structure are built on a particular pattern of logic. It is important to bear in mind that human sociality are directly governed and tied to a system of logic. The governing system of logic of any given society does not operate in a vacuum, as they are products of the thought processes of people in a particular society. This is where I end my presentation. Thank you so much, Christiana.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. That is those suffering from amnesia. I love that. I love that conclusion. Okay, so okay, maybe he's somewhere. So thank you very much, Diana, for that powerful conclusions, patrilineal and matrilineal. that is a very good introduction, words that should be introduced in our discourses. So with that, I'll call for questions. I'll collect the questions and then I will ask Diana. Please be brief. If you are not brief, I may be forced to cut you off. All right. So always put myself off. So first person is Umezurike and then Arabia. Please. And Diana, please note the questions and so you can go straight to the questions. And then I have Chogu.
Okay, thank you, Diana. That was a very powerful presentation. But at the tail end of your presentation, at the conclusion, you said something that I would like Pride to understand what you mean by that. How do we distance ourselves from Western branding or colonization, considering the fact that the language and whatever, because you say that the only way we can be ourselves.
Hello, Ms. Rika, are you there? Are you there? We can't hear you any longer.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead.
No, I said, my question is this. In her conclusion, she said the only way out of this problem we're having is to distance ourselves from the Western linguistic colonization and brand.
Okay.
We cannot do without Western language. Thank you.
Okay, then I hope, because of the interruptions, I hope you understood his question regarding language and, of course, colonial language and the language of maybe that we are functioning with. I think that should be the question. How can we distance ourselves when we are already, condemned to English language in a place like Africa where we can't even have a common language of communication without English or French or Portuguese and so on. So I will just note that down. Arabia, please.
All right, thank you very much, Diana, for your presentation. So along the lines of when you were speaking, you said something along the lines of the pain of third world women is the gain of white women. I'm just roughly paraphrasing. If that is what you said or close to what you said, I'm unsure what you mean by that. Could you explain what you mean? And also, my second question is, given the fact that most of these experiences of gender-based violence is a matter of power difference and certain forms of gratification that certain people have when they display their power, how would merely changing our way of thinking about Western logic or African logic and all those sort of things help the common person or the common on the streets who is a victim of gender-based violence or a perpetrator of gender-based violence based on other factors such as power difference and the need to express power? Thank you.
Thank you, Arabia. So I'll go to Chogu Abdul. Please, brief.
Thank you, Diana, for your presentation. I found a lot to unpack, but I'll just go straight to one question. You use concepts like Western oppositional logic, gender binary opposition, patriarchy, all to serve as, all to argue for reasons behind gender-based violence. I'm also glad that your discussion involves intersectionality. And one area that is also brought into intersectionality involves the queer theory or LGBTQ. Now, here in Nigeria, for example, there's this page I follow on Instagram. They call it LGBTQ9. And there I see a lot of stories of, let's say, female lesbians who complain of their female lesbian partners perpetrating violence against them, be it domestic abuse, be it even rape, okay, be it toxic environment and all that. Now this is a case of same-sex gender.
Yeah, Chobu, please go straight to the question you want to ask.
The question is, what societal structure or systemic practice can you use to explain same-sex violence, for example, between lesbians?
Okay, so I think we have many hands. I'll give Diana the first opportunity to answer, and then I will go to Amara and Nelson. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I will just start with the first question. How do we distance ourselves? I wasn't necessarily talking about changing the language we use in philosophizing and whatnot. I was actually saying that the idea or the concept of patriarchy is Western. So we need, when we are interrogating the concept of patriarchy in our discourses, we should also bear in mind that that concept is not African, it is Western. So for us to fully unveil the values of patrilineality from an African perspective, we must do away with that Western understanding of patriarchy that bifurcates reality. That's what I meant. So the second question is Arabia's question. I said the pain of what I was trying to, that wasn't my word actually, but I'll still explain it. What I was saying is that the gains of Western feminists is the pain or oppression of women of African descent, because, well, everything is in a form of hierarchical order, that it is the Western man, the Western woman, the African man before we get to the African woman. So what I'm saying is that even if the white women are advocating, or Western feminism are advocating for gender equality, that does not include women of African descent, because of the many intersectional interplay that comes to light when we start to interrogate the issue of gender inequality. So that's that. Then the last one, I don't think okay, now the one of violence between same sex. Like I said initially, I said that the problem that the problem of gender-based violence every single day is being broadened, and the reason why it becomes very complicated and dicey to even interrogate the issue of gender-based violence, and that is where I brought the LGBTQ plus thing, is because different gender identities are raising questions about gender equality, in how they want to be included and all of that. So if a lesbian, for instance, decides to be violent to the other person, it is still going to be termed gender-based. It's still going to be termed gender-based. We don't have a new concept or how we are going to conceptualize the violence, because violence is violence, irrespective of who is being violated. Thank you.
Hello, Diana. It seems you did not answer my question.
No, she answered it. I don't know if you weren't listening. So please, she answered it, and we are going to go on now. So Amara and Nelson, please ask your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Diana. Although my question has been hinted on, but I'll still go on to ask it. I think that there is a need for us to conceptualize something here. While she was making her talk, she seems to claim that women are the only ones that are subject to GBV. And for me, is there no need to differentiate between women as perpetrators and women as victims? Thank you.
Okay, noted. Nelson.
Okay, thank you very much. Mine is a little bit similar to what Amara has just asked. Well, I want to draw lessons from the Anatomy of the Female Power, written by Chiwenzu, where he argued that
against the notion that women are victims. This sense of women being, every time they are addressed as victims. So my question is, don't you think that the argument of GBV, gender-based violence, as necessarily prone and given to women who are the victims in almost all cases where such argument is raised? Don't you think there has to be a nuanced understanding of that, the notion of gender relation, in a case where we find women and demonstrating that sense of power, sexual power, emotional power against the male gender, all right, when it comes to filial relationships and stuff? So don't you think we need to really rethink the idea of gender? It's more or less a question that would require us to do some thinking, in terms of power interplay and power dynamics within the context of sexual power and sexual relationship. That's my question.
Okay, so Diana.
Yeah, thank you. I got the question. I'm just going to answer both Amara question and that of Nelson together. They are quite similar. No, Amara wasn't of the opinion that gender-based violence is targeted towards women alone. My argument is that I was hinting on the logic that promotes gender-based violence. Like I said, anybody can be a victim of gender-based violence. It was clearly stated on my paper, and when Christiana was introducing the paper, she did hint on that. So I felt like, okay, they have an idea about that. Let me go into my argument straight to the point. But my argument is not that women are only victims. No, that's not what I'm saying in my work. Nelson, you're right. Women are not victims alone. Like Prof. Francis was saying, a perpetrator of today can become a victim of tomorrow. A victim of today can also become a perpetrator of tomorrow, depending on the context you find yourself and the situation you find yourself. And I think we should not always streamline gender-based violence to sexual assault. The dynamics to gender-based violence is a whole lot. We have psychological violence, we have emotional violence, we have so many, we have people we have narcissists in relationships that can make you feel like it's best the hand is laid on you than the words that comes out from their mouth. So this thing is very complicated, and as you say, we have to keep thinking and rethinking on the way forward. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Diana. And I just want to make a quick comment. Diana has already mentioned that. I said it at the beginning that we recognize that men can be victims. We also recognize the diversity of gender understanding. But at the moment that we are focusing, I think I try to delimit our colloquium today. Otherwise, we'll be everywhere, moving from one end to the other, but we need to take it one step at a time. And then with regards to sex power, I could use it as kind of a reverse coloniality, an idea that can be interpreted within the idea of reverse coloniality. So using what is used to dominate you to dominate the other person. So I'm not go into that topic. I'm sure you must have read the book on the femme fatale, or how ancient people, even within African context, women use their sexual power to do that. But gender-based violence is more than just that. So we'll keep it at that for now. And thank you very much. So